and we're back again with what just may very well be the last episode of TTMUR, but more on that later. This week, the gang's back together with myself, Brian, and Ulysses. We're talking about the American classic, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, written in 1884. It is episode 99, and we are just one away from hitting a major milestone.
Alright, so Huck Finn, it's about this one kid.
Yes, it's about this one kid that does that one thing with that one guy in that one place. Excellent summary, Ulysses. Really, good job.
I wasn't finished. The book is about this kid named Huck, who runs away from home and then meets another runaway, a slave named Jim, which is owned by Miss Watson, and then adventures down the Mississippi River to eventually freedom.
This book isn't on my list of favorites, but I didn't hate it. I mostly just chose this book because it's an American classic and I felt an obligation to read it. So I just chose to read it just to be able to say I did.
I felt like the book had an actual plot, unlike Rights of Man. This book had suspense, which is shown in Chapter 4. When Twain ends with Huck finding Pep, he creates the suspense, so the reader will want to figure out what is going to happen next. While Twain could have continued this chapter, Twain decided to separate this event. This is one reason I preferred this over Rights of Man.
I didn't have any particularly strong feelings towards the book either. I enjoy the look back at history. I always do. It's a more enjoyable way of getting the mood of a time period without having to do much work. I felt uncomfortable with how Jim was portrayed. When Huck and Jim discuss why French people don't speak English, Jim ends the conversation by saying, well, it's a blame, ridiculous way, and I don't want to hear no more about it. They ain't no sense in it. But I guess I'll always be comfortable with it. Although it did have direction, plot, and a point to it, which is something that my favorite book to hate on, When You Are Engulfed in Flames, did not have.
But When You're Engulfed in Flames was just a collection of essays. Each essay had its own separate purpose, and there wasn't any purpose that was meant to tie all of them together. You were looking for something that the book wasn't meant to have. It's like eating broccoli and saying this is the worst cake I've ever eaten.
Let's just move on to purpose and viewpoint.
We decided that Twain's purpose was to present his views on slavery and the treatment of black people in the 19th century.
After meeting Jim and nearly setting him free, Huck is conflicted when he realizes that by helping his friend and letting him go, he was in fact going against the law. He was doing something that society considered bad, essentially stealing someone else's property away, but something that had to be right, setting an enslaved man free.
And that's the main thing we gain from this book being told from his point of view. We get a look at that conflict. Had it been told from a third-person point of view, we wouldn't have been given that.
The book Huck Finn is written in the point of view of Huckleberry Finn, which is first person. Since it is first person, we only know as readers what Huck knows. If this was written in third person, we would have been able to know what was occurring in Huck's hometown from which he fled. One thing that would have been helpful would be knowing that Miss Watson, who owned Jim, died, which will help us know that Jim was already free. This is how viewpoint affects what the reader knows.
Whatever personality traits a character has, the author gave those traits to them, and when they write the rest of their book, they should have the characters talk and act the way they're expected to, adhering to their personality. Unless it's a coming-of-age story where the character goes on a journey and they find out what kind of person they really are.
For example, in the Harry Potter series, in order to keep Harry in character, there is a limit to what he would do, and thus to what he would find out. However, there were a lot of things he needed to know and find out. In order to get around that, J.K. Rowling used Hermione, who is more inquisitive and academic-oriented in nature, to find information and relate it back to Harry.
But Huck Finn doesn't have his own Hermione. He doesn't have someone to figure out things for him. He goes about looking at his surroundings and trying to decide which definition of right he wants to adopt.
Having Huck as the sole narrator also affects the reader. They only see what Huck sees or what Huck talks about. It gives them a narrow view of the world around them. The reader may trust the fictional narrator more because they see what the writer wants them to see, and only that, and there's nothing they can do about it. There's nothing else there. On the other hand, In a work of nonfiction, the writer himself has the bias which affects the entire book, and the entire time the reader could suspect them of fudging the details in their favor, something that is expected in fiction.
The book was written in a southern rural dialect, since it's told from Huckleberry Finn's point of view. That's one part of this book that I really liked, or one of the parts. For me, it made Huck more likable as a character. I'm not sure why, but it may have been because he spoke informally, saying "warn't" or "ain't," and I guess it was like he was telling a story to a friend. This kind of language also shows what kind of environment Huck grew up in. He's not very educated, and he grew up in the rural areas. One thing I hated about the book being written this way was because it was really, really annoying to read Jim's lines. Like, some words are tolerable and recognizable, like ridiculous, and then you get other words like dad fetchest and going, it's like, what word is that supposed to be? And then you run into a page just full of these lines, and then you had to almost read it out loud to yourself, and it takes a lot longer because you had to look at every single letter and every single word to read it.
Rights of Man by Thomas Paine, the book that we read for last week's episode, was similar in how it was difficult to understand at parts. For different reasons, however. Rights of Man was hard to understand because it was archaic, language that is no longer used and can be considered outdated. Huck Finn was written in dialect, as one would speak. Since people do not speak like that anymore, it is hard to understand it, and you're not taught to understand dialect in class. In school, you are taught to understand the archaic language of ages ago. You read Shakespeare and whatnot, and teachers emphasize on understanding the formal forms. You don't get the same encouragement for books with dialect.
One of the main characters in this book was Jim. And as Brian described his dialect, it is very obvious that he was a slave and from the South. This had a lot of controversy because it was very explicit and it seemed pretty racist that Twain would write such a thing or such a character. Also, something that was very racist was the usage of the N-word. This book was one of the first books that included this word and this controversy in the whole nation.
Like we mentioned before, this book is infamous for the use of the N-word. There are editions where the word has been taken out completely, but we think that they may take away what Twain was trying to get across when he wrote this. One reason he had it in there was because that's just the way people spoke then. It was used liberally. And another reason was because this word is hurtful and it shows how black people were treated then. And even Huck, who we're led to believe in the book, is a honest, just person. But he even uses the word at some point.
The controversy over the usage of the word is similar to the controversy that was surrounding the movie Django Unchained, which was set before the Civil War and also used the N-word readily. A lot of the people were upset about the usage of the N-word. In both of these cases, yes, the word is upsetting and insulting and isn't acceptable in today's culture, no matter how much music may lead you to believe otherwise. Yet, these words were a big part of the time period that these books and movies were set in, and should not be ignored. You can't just gloss over what you don't like in history. That's like not enjoying the behavior during the Civil Rights Movement and removing it from textbooks around the country. When writing realistically, you have to be harshly true. There is also a list of words in this edition that shows which words were changed. And when I first flipped through the pages to start the book, I wondered why they were changed.
When I looked at this list, I noticed there were just a bunch of misspellings, and I was like, oh, that makes sense. But then I questioned why they wouldn't want to preserve the language. Why would they make these changes?
Maybe they just didn't have spell check back then.
A big part of the writing process is the editing process. Nothing is put out without being looked at and edited by at least one person, contrary to what the spelling mistakes in 50 Shades of Grey would lead you to believe. As much thought that goes into choosing words goes into deciding whether or not to take them out. It's important because writers don't always know how others will interpret their writing. They don't know if someone gets a certain illusion or if these words make sense together or read well or if this kind of phrase isn't really used in other parts of the world. That's what the editor is here for. Their job can be as simple as making sure words are spelled correctly or as difficult as choosing which words, sentences, and phrases should be taken out. It can be difficult, seeing as you aren't the writer, and you may not even be from the same time period as them, which is more common today when there are editors going back and editing books that were written long, long ago. Editing can make a piece, an essay, for example, go from a 6 to an 8. The consideration you put in looking back at your writing can bring your writing up to so many levels, and it's really useful.
In conclusion, the point of view your story is written from may help you to get your point across. In Twain's case, it gave us a look at Huck's internal conflict in setting Jim free. The language or dialect you use when writing can help you to get across what kind of environment the characters were raised in and experienced. But I believe it should be used sparingly because it may lead to confusion, as it did with me at least.
That's all, guys, I guess. Maybe for this week, maybe forever. We mentioned this earlier, but we've got some news. We might be going off air. No one's really sure yet. We're kind of torn up about it, but never fear, guys. They'll always be making us read things, even if we're not reporting them to you.
Thank you guys for sticking with us for 99 episodes, which is a lot. I'm kind of upset that we never got too lucky 100, where we would have recorded us in a death match to decide whether we talk about the Cat in the Hat, The Fault in Our Stars, or A Clockwork Apple.
Orange.
Apples, oranges, they're all fruit. Thanks again for being with us through all of this.
We appreciate it.